Throughout history, certain leaders have risen to power and left behind legacies not of greatness, but of extraordinary cruelty and devastation. These figures shaped the course of nations and millions of lives, often through inhumane policies, genocides, and acts of violence that defy comprehension. From Mao Zedong's horrific campaigns in China to Leopold II's brutal rule over the Congo, these men demonstrated how absolute power, coupled with relentless ambition, can lead to unimaginable suffering. The stories that follow provide an in-depth look into the most inhumane and evil acts committed by 10 of history's most notorious leaders, whose decisions caused irreparable damage to humanity. The Great Famine and Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong's leadership of China is marked by some of the most harrowing human tragedies in modern history. While his rise was cloaked in revolutionary ideals, his policies brought unprecedented suffering, especially through the disastrous Great Leap Forward and the subsequent Cultural Revolution. The Great Leap Forward was Mao's attempt to rapidly industrialize China and transform it into a global powerhouse. However, his plans were built on ignorance and misinformation. Mao's obsession with surpassing the West led to reckless agricultural reforms, including collectivization and the establishment of rural communes. Farmers were ordered to produce steel in backyard furnaces, diverting them from cultivating food. Compounding this were impossible quotas set by officials eager to gain Mao's favor, resulting in inflated grain production reports. As these false numbers circulated, Mao demanded more grain to be exported, leaving rural populations without sustenance. The result was catastrophic. The countryside was ravaged by famine, and people starved en masse. An estimated 30 to 45 million Chinese perished, many resorting to cannibalism in a desperate bid to survive. The famine wasn't merely the outcome of failed policy. Mao refused to acknowledge the disaster, dismissing concerns and punishing those who dared to speak out. As China emerged from famine, Mao initiated another horrifying campaign, the Cultural Revolution. In an effort to reassert control after the failures of the Great Leap Forward, Mao incited youth across China, forming the Red Guards, who were tasked with purging society of bourgeois elements and enemies of the revolution. Teachers, intellectuals, and perceived counter-revolutionaries were targeted in brutal public humiliations, torture, and execution. The youth militias, armed with Mao's Little Red Book, became agents of violence, upending families, schools, and industries in the name of ideological purity. Mao's personal role in overseeing both these campaigns showed his detachment from human suffering. His disregard for life, combined with his ideological zeal, ensured that his reign would become synonymous with one of the largest state-imposed humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. Rome's Mad Emperor. Caligula's reign as Emperor of Rome was brief, but in those 4 years, his behavior was so extreme that he remains a symbol of unchecked power and cruelty. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Caligula's early life was marred by tragedy and suspicion, fostering a deep paranoia. His reign began with promise, but quickly devolved into madness. Perhaps the most notorious of Caligula's acts was his declaration that he was a living god, demanding that the Roman Senate treat him as such. Temples were erected in his honor, and he ordered statues of himself to be placed in Jewish synagogues, igniting widespread unrest. Caligula's delusions of grandeur were matched by his sadistic cruelty. He's said to have enjoyed watching people suffer, and executions were often public spectacles. In one infamous episode, Caligula hosted games where criminals were forced to fight wild animals, and if there weren't enough criminals, he reportedly ordered random citizens to be thrown into the arena. The emperor's sexual depravity also knew no bounds. He infamously committed incest with his sisters and forced the wives of senators into prostitution. His debauchery and self-indulgence extended to financial ruin. He drained the empire's treasury on lavish projects, including plans to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul. He even built a floating palace on a massive ship, fitted with gardens and baths. Caligula's reign of terror culminated in his assassination by members of his own guard, who had grown weary of his arbitrary executions and unhinged behavior. While his rule was short, the depth of his depravity left an indelible mark on Roman history, showcasing the dangers of absolute power in the hands of a madman. The Butcher of the Congo. Leopold II's private colonization of the Congo Free State is one of the darkest chapters in colonial history. As the King of Belgium, Leopold portrayed himself as a benevolent ruler, claiming that his acquisition of the Congo was driven by a desire to civilize the African people. In reality, his reign was motivated by greed and resulted in one of the most brutal exploitation campaigns the world has ever seen. Leopold's Congo was not a colony, but his personal possession. In pursuit of profit, he established a brutal system centered around the extraction of rubber, which had become highly valuable due to the Industrial Revolution. Villages were required to meet impossible rubber quotas, and failure to do so resulted in horrific punishments. Soldiers of the Force Publique, Leopold's private army, were instructed to sever the hands of villagers, men, women and children alike, as proof that bullets had not been wasted. The exploitation of the Congo's natural resources and the systematic abuse of its people led to the deaths of an estimated 10 million Congolese. Starvation, disease, and the brutal violence inflicted by Leopold's agents decimated entire communities. The atrocities in the Congo remained largely unknown to the world until missionaries and whistleblowers, such as the journalist Idi Amin, exposed the horrors. Leopold II never faced justice for his crimes. Even after international pressure forced him to cede control of the Congo to the Belgian government in 1908, he continued to amass wealth from his African exploitation. His legacy as one of the cruelest colonial rulers is a stark reminder of the devastation caused by imperial greed. Year Zero and the killing fields. Pol Pot, leader of the Khmer Rouge, orchestrated one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century in Cambodia. Between 1975 and 1979, Pol Pot's radical vision of an agrarian communist utopia led to the deaths of approximately 2 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the country's population, through starvation, forced labor, and execution. Upon taking control, Pol Pot declared that Cambodia would begin at Year Zero, erasing all traces of modernity and intellectualism. Cities were evacuated, and millions were forced into labor camps in the countryside. Doctors, teachers, engineers, and anyone with an education or who wore glasses were targeted for extermination as enemies of the revolution. The Khmer Rouge's methods were brutal. Cambodians worked in grueling conditions with little food, and mass executions became a routine method of control. The notorious killing fields were the sites of countless massacres, where prisoners were bludgeoned to death to save bullets. Entire families were murdered to prevent the possibility of revenge. Pol Pot's regime also used child soldiers to carry out atrocities, brainwashing them into becoming ruthless killers. Children as young as 10 were indoctrinated into the Khmer Rouge's ideology and encouraged to spy on and report their families for counter-revolutionary activities. Pol Pot's genocidal policies came to an end when Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1979, overthrowing his regime. Despite the staggering death toll and the decimation of Cambodia's cultural and intellectual fabric, Pol Pot evaded justice and died in 1998, never having been held accountable for the horrors he unleashed. Vodou, violence, and fear in Haiti. By the time of his death in 1971, Papa Doc Duvalier had solidified his control over every aspect of Haitian life, leaving behind a legacy of fear and repression that continued under his son, Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier. François Papa Doc Duvalier's reign, from 1957 to 1971, is remembered as one of the most brutal in the Caribbean, not only for its violent repression, but also for its calculated manipulation of Haitian Vodou and superstition. Papa Doc Duvalier was a physician by training, but he wielded power like a tyrant. After becoming president, he quickly established a dictatorship by dissolving the National Assembly and forming a paramilitary force known as the Tonton Macoute, or Bogeymen. This death squad, recognizable by their blue denim uniforms and sunglasses, became the main enforcers of Duvalier's rule. They committed atrocities in broad daylight, including executions, rapes, and extortion. Anyone suspected of opposing the regime was subject to disappearance, often leaving families without answers or bodies to bury. Duvalier's genius was infusing political terror with spiritual fear. He portrayed himself as a Vodou Hungan and cultivated the image of a mystical ruler with connections to the spirit world. He claimed that Baron Samedi, the Vodou spirit of death, was a personal ally, and many Haitians feared that to oppose him would incur supernatural retribution. In a country where Vodou played a central role in daily life, this blending of religion and politics made Duvalier's regime especially oppressive. The Tonton Macoute were believed to be not only brutal enforcers, but also imbued with mystical powers, which only deepened the public's terror. Under Duvalier's rule, Haiti descended into a nightmarish state of lawlessness and poverty. Public services crumbled, and the country became more isolated as Duvalier used his secret police to eliminate rivals and silence dissenters. Journalists, intellectuals, and political opponents were often imprisoned, tortured, or executed. The economy, meanwhile, was plundered for Duvalier's personal gain. He siphoned off millions of dollars of foreign aid into personal accounts while ordinary Haitians languished in extreme poverty. One of Duvalier's most infamous acts of repression was the massacre of Jérémie in 1964. After a failed coup attempt, led by a group of young intellectuals known as the Jeune Haiti movement, Duvalier ordered the Tonton Macoute to massacre their families and supporters. The slaughter lasted for days, with entire families murdered in cold blood as a warning to anyone who dared challenge his authority. Upon his death in 1971, Duvalier named his 19-year-old son, Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier, as his successor. Although Baby Doc's rule lacked the spiritual manipulation of his father, the corruption and repression continued, further entrenching the family's legacy of tyranny. Papa Doc's reign of terror left Haiti a broken and traumatized nation, steeped in fear and superstition. His calculated use of Vodou and the violent enforcement of his rule ensured that Haiti remained under his oppressive thumb even after his death, and contributed to the long-term destabilization of the country. The Oprichnina and the Reign of Terror. Ivan the Terrible earned his moniker through a reign of bloodshed and psychological warfare that has few parallels in history. Ivan ruled Russia from 1547 to 1584, and his legacy is dominated by his ruthless centralization of power and the implementation of his personal militia, the Oprichnina, which terrorized Russia for nearly a decade. Ivan's early reign was marked by progressive reforms and territorial expansion, but after the death of his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560, Ivan's mental state began to deteriorate. His increasing paranoia and suspicion of the boyar nobility led him to unleash the Oprichniki, a group of black-clad enforcers who answered directly to Ivan. This secret police force was tasked with quelling opposition to the Tsar and purging those Ivan deemed disloyal. However, their real purpose was far more sinister: to instill fear through violence and public terror. The Oprichniki operated outside the law, with free rein to torture, confiscate property, and execute at will. Their most infamous act of brutality was the sacking of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan suspected the wealthy city of plotting rebellion, and in response, he ordered his Oprichniki to destroy it. The army laid siege to the city, looting homes and massacring tens of thousands of men, women, and children. Novgorod's fall was a symbol of Ivan's paranoia, turned into policy. Any perceived dissent, real or imagined, would be met with extreme cruelty. Ivan's personal instability also manifested in horrifying acts of violence against his own family. In 1581, during an argument with his pregnant daughter-in-law, Ivan beat her so severely that she miscarried. When his son, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about the incident, the Tsar, in a fit of rage, struck his son on the head with a staff, killing him. This tragic event not only robbed Ivan of his heir, but also left Russia in a state of succession crisis, ultimately leading to the Time of Troubles. Ivan's legacy is a complicated one. He expanded Russia's borders and centralized state power, laying the foundations for the modern Russian Empire. Yet his reign of terror, especially the use of the Oprichnina, left a scar on the Russian psyche. The widespread fear and repression Ivan instilled would echo through Russian history, influencing how future rulers wielded power. Ivan the Terrible's reign serves as a grim reminder of how a leader's paranoia can transform a nation into a kingdom of fear and violence. Uganda's reign of terror. Idi Amin, who ruled Uganda from 1971 to 1979, stands as one of Africa's most notorious dictators. Known for his unpredictable behavior, extravagant proclamations, and ruthless repression, Amin's regime was marked by brutality, human rights abuses, and a near-total collapse of the Ugandan state. Amin's rise to power began with a military coup in 1971, overthrowing the regime of Milton Obote. Initially welcomed by many Ugandans, Amin quickly revealed his authoritarian nature, beginning a reign of terror that would leave an estimated 300,000 people dead. Amin's targets included political opponents, ethnic groups such as the Acholi and Lango, and even members of his own government and military. The notorious State Research Bureau, Amin's secret police, carried out widespread torture and executions in makeshift detention centers across the country. One of Amin's most infamous acts was the expulsion of Uganda's Asian population in 1972. Claiming to restore Uganda to its rightful owners, Amin ordered the expulsion of over 70,000 people of Indian descent, many of whom were Ugandan citizens. Their businesses and property were confiscated and given to Amin's cronies, leading to economic collapse. Uganda's infrastructure crumbled as the country's skilled and professional class was driven out, leaving a vacuum of expertise and causing widespread poverty. Amin's violence was not limited to domestic opponents. His regime became internationally notorious in 1976 when he allowed Palestinian hijackers to land a hijacked Air France plane at Entebbe airport. Amin supported the hijackers, who took over 100 hostages. The incident ended with a dramatic raid by Israeli commandos, but Amin's involvement in international terrorism cemented his reputation as a dangerous and unpredictable leader. Amin's reign was characterized by bizarre claims and grandiose titles, such as proclaiming himself conqueror of the British Empire. His lavish lifestyle stood in stark contrast to the impoverishment of the Ugandan people, who suffered under food shortages, economic decline, and constant fear of the regime's violence. He regularly indulged in outlandish behavior, such as publicly displaying the severed heads of his enemies, and even allegedly practicing cannibalism. Amin's rule came to an end in 1979 after Uganda was invaded by Tanzanian forces, supported by Ugandan exiles. He fled into exile, first in Libya and later Saudi Arabia, where he lived until his death in 2003. Despite never being held accountable for the atrocities committed under his regime, Amin's legacy remains one of the darkest chapters in African history, a reminder of how unchecked power can devastate a nation. Fascism's rise and brutal reign. Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator from 1922 to 1943, set the stage for a new kind of authoritarian regime that combined extreme nationalism, militarism, and ruthless suppression of opposition. Mussolini's rise to power and subsequent rule not only reshaped Italy, but also influenced the broader trajectory of European politics, particularly through his partnership with Adolf Hitler. His legacy, however, is one of terror, oppression, and misguided ambition, culminating in disaster during World War II. Mussolini began his political career as a socialist, but following World War I, he radically shifted toward fascism, tapping into Italy's post-war disillusionment and economic chaos. Promising to restore Italy's lost grandeur, Mussolini capitalized on widespread fear of communism and disorder. In 1922, he orchestrated the March on Rome, a calculated display of force where thousands of black shirts, his paramilitary enforcers, converged on the capital. Faced with Mussolini's growing influence and fearing civil unrest, King Victor Emmanuel III appointed him as prime minister, effectively handing him control of Italy without significant resistance. Once in power, Mussolini wasted no time consolidating authority. By 1925, he had declared himself dictator and adopted the title Il Duce. He dismantled democratic institutions, outlawed political opposition, and imposed strict censorship, creating a totalitarian state where dissent was met with brutal repression. The Black Shirts, originally formed as a militant wing of the Fascist Party, became the regime's main instrument of terror, attacking and murdering political opponents, especially socialists and communists. Mussolini's domestic policies were marked by aggressive economic reforms aimed at modernizing Italy's infrastructure and military. He launched massive public works projects, such as the draining of the Pontine marshes and the construction of new towns like Litoria, which became symbols of fascist efficiency. However, these achievements were overshadowed by his oppressive social policies, which sought to control every aspect of Italian life, from education and labor unions to culture and personal behavior. Mussolini's regime also enforced traditional gender roles, promoting large families to boost Italy's population for future military conquests. One of the most tragic consequences of Mussolini's rule was his disastrous imperial ambition. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, using chemical weapons and committing widespread atrocities against civilians. The invasion, part of his dream to recreate a Roman Empire, led to Italy's international isolation and alienation from the League of Nations, but it bolstered Mussolini's domestic standing. He portrayed himself as a restorer of Italian glory, and the victory in Ethiopia made him a hero in the eyes of many Italians. However, Mussolini's greatest miscalculation came with his alliance with Adolf Hitler. Initially reluctant to embrace Nazi ideology, Mussolini grew increasingly dependent on Hitler as his own popularity waned. By the late 1930s, Mussolini had aligned Italy with Nazi Germany, adopting similar racial policies, including the infamous anti-Semitic laws of 1938, which stripped Italian Jews of their civil rights. The alliance sealed Italy's fate in World War II. Mussolini's leadership during the war was characterized by a series of catastrophic military decisions. Italian forces were woefully unprepared for the conflicts Mussolini dragged them into, including the invasions of Greece and North Africa, both of which ended in failure. As the war dragged on, Mussolini's popularity plummeted and Italy descended into chaos. In 1943, following the Allied invasion of Sicily, Mussolini was deposed and arrested by his own government. Rescued by German forces, he was installed as the puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy, a regime that existed only because of Nazi support. His second rule was brief and brutal, marked by increased violence against partisans and civilians alike. In 1945, as the Axis powers collapsed, Mussolini attempted to flee to Switzerland but was captured by Italian partisans. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were executed, and their bodies were publicly displayed in Milan, a grim end to the man who had once dreamed of leading a new Roman Empire. Mussolini's reign left Italy in ruins, both economically and socially. His authoritarian policies, aggressive nationalism, and misguided imperial ambitions not only destroyed his country, but also contributed to the broader devastation of Europe during World War II. The Holocaust and World War II, Adolf Hitler's rise to power, and the atrocities he committed during his rule remain some of the darkest chapters in human history. Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, transformed Germany from a democratic republic into a totalitarian state that propagated extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and racial purity. His leadership not only caused the deaths of millions during World War II, but also led to the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, one of the most horrific genocides in human history. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler's early life was marked by rejection and frustration. After failing to gain acceptance into art school, Hitler moved to Munich, Germany, and served as a soldier in World War I. The devastation of the war and Germany's defeat deeply impacted Hitler, who blamed Germany's loss on internal enemies, primarily Jews and communists. In the years that followed, he rose through the ranks of the fledgling Nazi Party, capitalizing on widespread economic hardship, social unrest, and anger at the Treaty of Versailles, which many Germans viewed as a national humiliation. By 1933, Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany. Through a combination of propaganda, manipulation, and violence, he quickly consolidated power, declaring himself Führer in 1934, after the death of President Paul von Hindenburg. Hitler's vision for Germany was centered on the idea of Aryan racial superiority and the belief that Jews, Slavs, Roma, and other groups were racially inferior and should be eradicated. His regime promoted aggressive nationalism, militarism, and anti-Semitism, laying the groundwork for war and genocide. The Nazi state was characterized by strict control over all aspects of life. Hitler's government utilized extensive propaganda, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, to glorify the Führer and the Nazi ideology. The Nazi Party also relied on brutal enforcement by the Gestapo and the SS, who persecuted political opponents, dissidents, and minority groups. In 1939, Hitler's ambitions for territorial expansion led to the invasion of Poland, triggering World War II. Over the next few years, Nazi Germany launched a campaign of conquest across Europe, occupying vast territories and committing widespread atrocities against civilians, particularly in Eastern Europe. Hitler's plan, known as Lebensraum, sought to provide living space for Germans by exterminating or enslaving the populations of the occupied regions. However, the most horrific aspect of Hitler's rule was the Holocaust. The Nazi regime systematically murdered 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, including Roma, disabled individuals, Polish and Soviet civilians, political prisoners, and homosexuals. This genocide was carried out through mass shootings, forced labor, and most infamously extermination camps like Auschwitz, where people were gassed, starved, or worked to death. The industrial scale of the Holocaust, with its cold efficiency and sheer brutality, remains unparalleled in human history. By 1945, the tide of the war had turned against Hitler. Allied forces closed in on Germany from the west, while Soviet troops advanced from the east. In April 1945, as Berlin was surrounded, Hitler retreated to his underground bunker. On April 30th, 1945, with Germany in ruins and defeat inevitable, Hitler committed suicide along with his wife, Eva Braun. Hitler's death marked the end of the Nazi regime, but the horrors of his rule left a permanent scar on the world. The Holocaust, the devastation of World War II, and the brutal totalitarianism of the Nazi state continue to serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, extreme nationalism, and hatred. The Great Purge and Gulags. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s until his death in 1953, oversaw one of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century. While he played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany during World War II, his domestic policies caused the deaths of millions of his own people. Stalin's reign was marked by widespread terror, purges of perceived enemies, and the use of forced labor camps, known as Gulags, to maintain his grip on power. Stalin came to power following the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, gradually outmaneuvering his rivals to become the undisputed leader of the Communist Party. Once in control, Stalin initiated a series of ambitious but disastrous economic policies aimed at rapidly transforming the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian society into an industrial superpower. Central to this plan was the forced collectivization of agriculture, which led to widespread famine. The most infamous of these famines occurred in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, known as the Holodomor, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 3 to 4 million people. As Stalin consolidated his rule, he became increasingly paranoid, convinced that enemies were lurking everywhere. In the late 1930s, this paranoia culminated in the Great Purge, a campaign of political repression that saw hundreds of thousands of people executed or sent to the Gulags. Stalin targeted members of the Communist Party, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens alike, accusing them of plotting against the state. Show trials were staged for high-profile figures, while countless others were arrested in the dead of night and either executed or imprisoned without trial. The Gulags, labor camps scattered across the vast Soviet Union, became a symbol of the brutal repression under Joseph Stalin's regime. These camps were notorious for their inhumane conditions, where millions of prisoners, many falsely accused of crimes against the state, were subjected to forced labor. Inmates were often tasked with back-breaking work, such as mining, logging, or constructing infrastructure projects, all while enduring starvation, exposure to the elements, and brutal treatment by camp guards. Death from exhaustion, malnutrition, or disease was common, and for many, the gulags were essentially death camps. The Gulag system expanded dramatically during the Great Purge of the late 1930s. Stalin's increasing paranoia about opposition, both real and imagined, drove him to launch a campaign to eliminate perceived enemies within the Communist Party, the military, and society at large. Anyone suspected of disloyalty or insufficient enthusiasm for Stalin's policies could be branded a traitor. Political purges swept through every level of Soviet society, resulting in widespread arrests, executions, and deportations to the gulags. Party officials, intellectuals, military leaders, and even ordinary workers were caught in the web of Stalin's terror. At the height of the purges, entire families were imprisoned or executed without trial. Children of those deemed enemies of the people were sent to orphanages or re-education camps, where they were taught to denounce their parents. High-profile purges included the Great Terror of 1936 to 1938, during which many of the original Bolshevik revolutionaries, along with senior military officers, were executed after farcical show trials. In these trials, the accused were forced to confess to absurd charges under torture, only to be executed shortly after. One of the most significant impacts of the purges was on the Red Army, as Stalin eliminated many of his top military commanders. This had catastrophic consequences during World War II, as the Soviet Union initially struggled to repel the Nazi invasion, partly due to the loss of experienced military leadership. Despite the devastation inflicted by Stalin's purges, his control over the country was absolute by the time World War II began. The terror didn't end with the purges. During the war, Stalin continued his repressive policies, deporting entire ethnic groups he deemed untrustworthy, such as the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and Volga Germans, to remote regions of Siberia and Central Asia. Many of these people perished during the harsh relocations and in the labor camps where they were imprisoned. By the time of Stalin's death in 1953, it's estimated that up to 20 million people had died as a result of his policies, including those who perished in the Gulags, were executed during the purges, or died in the man-made famines caused by forced collectivization. Stalin's legacy remains one of the most brutal in history, where paranoia and a thirst for absolute power led to the destruction of millions of lives. Conclusion. The legacies of the 10 historical figures we have explored here are grim reminders of the extent to which unchecked power, radical ideologies, and brutal governance can devastate nations and destroy millions of lives. Each of these leaders, from Mao Zedong to Joseph Stalin, wielded authority in a way that disregarded the inherent value of human life. Their actions were motivated by a combination of personal ambition, ideological extremism, and a desire for control. And they inflicted unimaginable suffering on their own people, as well as on those beyond their borders. Mao Zedong's policies led to the deaths of millions, dismantling traditional Chinese culture and unleashing mass chaos during the Cultural Revolution. Caligula's descent into madness turned Rome into a dangerous and unpredictable empire where cruelty was a spectacle. Leopold II's exploitation of the Congo for personal profit devastated entire populations, as his regime slaughtered millions for rubber and ivory. Pol Pot's radical agrarian vision for Cambodia resulted in one of the most devastating genocides in history, wiping out nearly a quarter of the population. Adolf Hitler's racial ideologies led to the Holocaust, the genocide of 6 million Jews, and the devastation of Europe during World War II. Doc Duvalier used a lethal combination of superstition and violent repression to control Haiti, while Ivan the Terrible established one of the earliest examples of a police state, with his Oprichnina enforcing a reign of terror. Idi Amin's brutal dictatorship in Uganda left a bloody legacy of human rights abuses, and Mussolini's fascism not only dragged Italy into disastrous wars, but also left a legacy of violence and ruin. Joseph Stalin's paranoia culminated in the Great Purge, sending millions to their deaths in the Gulags and erasing any semblance of dissent. Each of these men exemplifies how absolute power can lead to absolute devastation. Their policies, decisions, and ideologies did not just kill millions, but also eroded the social fabric of their nations, creating atmospheres of fear, distrust, and widespread suffering. These stories serve as a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked leadership and the importance of preserving human rights and accountability. While their reigns have ended, the consequences of their actions continue to shape the world today, reminding us of the vital need to safeguard justice, democracy, and humanity. Thank you for spending time with us through Spookscope today. Feel free to share your knowledge and wisdom in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends and family. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious.